And tonight we have José González here, who is the founder of Latino Outdoors and also the co-founder of Outdoorist Oath. And he's going to be talking with us tonight and presenting, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions. I also just wanted to introduce our staff, and particularly Karen Steele, who is the president of the Broomfield Open Space Foundation. And they're a nonprofit that supports all the things that we do. And we really couldn't serve the community without them. Lexi Brewer will be coordinating the meeting tonight. She's our open space specialist. Chloe Chalikian is our open space tech, and she's also here to help. And then Beverly Burbach is here with her little son, Cooper, to also assist. And thanks to Kyle with IT. So with that, Lexi, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Hola, bienvenido. Hello and welcome to everyone. We are so excited to welcome José González tonight. Primero, si hay algún hispanohablante, por favor, escríbenos en el chat. If there's any Spanish speakers there, please let us know in the chat. La presentación está en inglés, pero podemos traducir algunas partes si es necesario. So we are going to present in Spanish, but if there are any parts that we can translate, please let us know that too. José González is the founder at Latino Outdoors and co-founder at the Outdoorist Oath. Latino Outdoors is a Latin-led organization that supports a national community of leaders in outdoor recreation, conservation, and environmental education. They're providing leadership, mentorship, and professional development opportunities while serving as a platform for amplifying often overlooked cultural connections and narratives. He also serves on several volunteer leadership positions in the field, including as a trustee for the National Outdoor Leadership School, a trustee for the National Recreation Foundation, Parks Now Board Director, Resource Media Board Director, counselor for Save the Redwoods League, among others. So very busy schedule, doing absolutely incredible work. We are thrilled to have Jose here to speak with us about outdoor equity, which is something that is very near and dear to our hearts here at Broomfield Open Space and Trails. So with that, I will kick it over to Jose to lead us on.
Right. Thank you so much. Gracias, Lexi. First, to anybody that is watching live or whether you're watching this recording, I'm glad that you could be here. Gracias a todos. Si están viendo esto en vivo o si después ven la grabación, espero que si hay preguntas o comentarios que lo compartan. And so I want to share a couple of things. First of all, José González, he, him, his, and I usually live in Sacramento, California. Although I get the privilege and benefit of sometimes joining from different other places and getting to visit different communities. In fact, I am excited to be in Leadville, Colorado this coming Saturday. And so I'll be passing by and waving to all of the communities in Broomfield. And so I want to start by a couple of things. I'll be sharing some slides that create quite a bit of scope in terms of how I think about and approach this work, how it's woven into my own lived experience, the story of me as an immigrant kid from Mexico, the work of Latino Outdoors, and then, of course, how it's grounded in really to be able to connect all communities to our public lands, open spaces, the outdoors in nature, and what that has meant when even I look at my own Latina identity. So I'm excited to be here with you all. And then there is an opportunity for Q&A. So if as I'm going through, if a question pops up and you're here live, drop it in, but we'll have some time at the end as well. So let me start off and do a share. So you should all be able to see on your screen me there. This was a project that I did in support of a colleague and friend who was running through different national monuments in the Western United States. So in this particular case, we were out in the Organ Peaks National Monument in southern New Mexico. And I agreed to join for a couple of reasons, not just to support a friend and a community member that's active in support of public lands, but also to connect to sometimes we have aspects of our public lands that can sound a little wonky, like national monuments, and be like, well, what's a national monument? What does that matter? Is that like a national park? Is that like a state park? Why is it important? And so that connection to some of these, what I think of them as concepts and constructs of our public lands, matter because to me, I want them to matter to anybody and everybody that goes out, sees the landscape, sees the mountains, and they may not be aware that there's these different layers of protections and jurisdictions and managements and agencies and so forth. The first thing that they're probably thinking is, these look amazing. I love being out here. This grounds me. This is scenic. This is beautiful, but it's a both hand. And then also that, as you see me there, I have one of the bandanas that I took with me. And it's one of the examples of how I say, I grew up with the sense of feeling like I had to leave my cultura at the trailhead, that once I started on a trail, I now had to fit a particular view or model of what it meant to be outdoorsy. But increasingly, both through the work that I've done and what I call my cultural wayfinding, it's more about how can I pack my cultura with me in my trail bag. And it can be everything, not just in the mannerisms and in the stories. It can be the literal things that I carry with me as well. For example, this bandana that was created by a community artist in Tucson, Arizona, and it represents one of the moon deities from Mesoamerica. And so they're just little images that for me, when people ask me like, why do I have that? It's because it is part of my cultural identity. Very much like how I carry my huaraches whenever I can in most of these spaces. So I'm starting there in the sense of, what it meant to be born in Mexico, come to the United States, be associated with a term like Latino, and then finding my own sense of self that started with quite a bit of shame in terms of who I was growing up as a kid in California. There was a lot of cultural cues that basically said, if you're Mexican, it's not a great thing. Si eres mexicano, no necesariamente es una buena cosa. And so it was little things about, how often do you speak Spanish? What is the food that you eat? How do you dress? All of these little things. And I don't say this in the sense that there is one way to do it and approach it, but I think that it was common in the way that a lot of, especially a lot of kids and youth that have pretty strong ethnic cultural identities, and they're trying to figure out how do we fit in? What is a sense of belonging? What does it mean to contribute to the American identity while still knowing you're growing up at home with, for example, parents that speak Spanish primarily, with foods that are different, with figuring out what are the ways in which you can express yourselves in ways that doesn't make you stand out, in ways that doesn't feel good. And so I say this because to me, part of figuring that out also came with this connection and interest to the outdoors. So it's one thing to figure out the process of saying, hey, I'm Mexicano by birth nationality, I'm a US citizen through naturalization, I'm Latino through social cultural identity, I'm Chicano through social political identity, and I'm Hispanic by census count. And then what does all that mean? And how can I be all of those things? And then what does it mean to be outdoorsy and try to connect to the cultural constructs of that identity? And so that led the journey for me. Some of you might be familiar with some of these images, some of you might be not. It is from my Mexican television program, El Chavo del Ocho en Chespirito. They have expression and phrases like no contaban con mi astucia. And I use those as examples of having a sense of cultural elements that resonated with me as a kid, and that I'm also connecting to more cultural elements growing up in the United States. And sometimes we think of some of that as code switching, not just linguistic code switching, like including both English and Spanish, but also cultural code switching. What does it mean to have different aspects of switching from one type of cultural mannerisms to another? And to me, that's important because early on, it felt like cultural code switching came from a strong sense of survival, needing to fit in, to not stand out in ways that be negative, and moving from cultural code switching from surviving for thriving. So for me, it was to say, it's not just about being bicultural. I want to be ambicultural in the way that I can be ambidextrous. And so what could that look like as ambicultural leadership in the way that we can be out here in the outdoors as well? And that led me to unpack these ideas around, well, how do we take questions like, for example, does the Latino community care about the outdoors? How are they engaged? Would they show up for restoration events? How do we know what they're interested in? Take that and then realize that a lot of the data would begin to show there's actually a strong sense of interest, of connection. You can look at surveys nowadays and show that communities of color across the board are invested in caring about nature, the outdoors, and our public lands, and that there might be still questions of underrepresentation or not representation. So what does that mean? Because then to me, it opened up the work around what we call structural elements, that it wasn't just individual preference, it wasn't just community preference. We have to really look at what types of barriers are in place, or what elements are there that facilitate or impede community engagement with the outdoors. And I say this because a lot of the work that happens now with community nonprofits, that works with agencies, that works at outdoor access and equity, and when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, is we touch on some elements that seem big, that may feel uncomfortable, that we may not have familiarity with, that we can struggle to figure out what that means, and that have elements of discomfort. So when we talk about like structural privilege, or when we talk about power. And so for me, it's taking all of these elements and grounding it, I say, in some in like some core inevitabilities. One of them is the demographic inevitability, that we say, hey, the demographics of the country, of certain states, of even certain counties, are just going to be different in 2050 compared to 1950. And rather than seeing that as like a zero sum or some sense of concern, we say, well, what does it mean to embrace the power and value of the diversity that comes from that? Because it is there. And then the other kind of the other inevitability is just a lot of the historical realities of how different communities were able to experience the outdoors, both through harm, through joy, through trauma, through connection. That whole spectrum was there. And so again, it wasn't just about individual preferences and choices. And so when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and even justice-oriented work, for me is, what does it mean to support, to create, to engage in the spaces that leverage the best of ourselves with the power and the value add of diversity, to build on the conservation successes that we've had, to create the kind of public land systems that we know is possible, that benefits everybody. And really, I often say is that we are creating the maps of the future that are very different than the maps that we've inherited, and that can be amazing and great. And so some examples of that for me are by starting by looking at some of the initial what I call them, some of the initial stories, some of the initial narratives, some of the initial starting points, interrogating some of these starting things that we presume may be normative or the default. Something like, who is outdoorsy? What does outdoorsy mean? If I care about this natural landscape, how can somebody else also care about it and might be starting from a very different place than mine? And that doesn't mean that we have to convert each other to that, but how could that be additive? So some examples. Take, for example, you can see a chart like this. This is from the Outdoor Foundation via the Outdoor Industry Association, where I'm also on the board. And this is a participation report. And you could look at some of this and see that the identified Black demographic here, and as a green line, is relatively low compared to the other ones. And for some, that fits part of the narrative that people say, if I'm part of the Black African American community, those outdoorsy things are not for me. Okay. And that could align with something like this 2017 Nature of American Studies that asks different questions about interest in some of these activities. And if the question is, what is your interest in hiking? And then the responses are like this, and you could, what one takeaway here is interest in hiking is lowest among Black adults, 19% for a lot. And again, that can fit that narrative that some people say, yeah, that's not for us, or that's a that community kind of thing. And yet, if you were to ask the question, not interest in hiking, but what about interest in walking outdoors, they all shoot up. And so what is it about hiking and walking outdoors that's different? And I often say it's, you're asking your body, yourself, to engage in the same physical thing. But what might be different is the picture of what hiking means, the cultural construct of what that looks like, and how we affirm that for each other. And so in other words, if I have a picture of what hiking is, and I reinforce that to the exclusion of others who are perfectly capable and excited to do the same thing, but I'm creating those boundaries, that's where I say that's where the work is. That's where I don't try to tell people, well, I guess you're not a hiker, or you have to hike like me. I begin to say, what is it about hiking that I don't need to be complicit in creating exclusion for it? How can I be complicit in expanding that definition of hiking so that it's inclusive of a lot of other people that already are interested in it? And that's what led to the founding of Latino Outdoors. And I'll share a little bit more about that, because it was me to be able to say, if I'm hearing the question, do Latinos care about the outdoors? I was like, we should really be flipping that question to say, how do they care about the outdoors? And how might they be interested and care and be passionate about it in ways that we're not familiar with, but that we can then create some of those connections. So it's less of a kind of making them feel like they need to be forced to convert to be outdoorsy like we are, and think more about how can I be inclusive of some of their interests while being additive to some of the interests that I have as well. And so for Latino Outdoors, that meant let's take the broad variety and diversity of quote unquote Latinidad. I call it a beautiful mess because it encompasses so much. And let's connect that with the variety and diversity of outdoor experiences, and not be prescriptive about it and tell people this is exactly what, having a Latina identity and being outdoorsy means. Rather is, let's see what the community shows us. Let's see what that abundance looks like. And then I've connected that to recently thinking about how this connection to land, this valuing of our natural landscapes, the language of ecology, things that a lot of us that are outdoorsy or nature-based, or involved in conservation, environmental work, things that we know, that we get, that we care about. What does that mean in support of cultural relevance, in support of social justice work, in support of not just the relationships to land, but the relationships with each other? And so I've used that to kind of interrogate the logic to help me be more culturally inclusive, to expand on the work of Latino Outdoors and works like the Outdoorist Oath, And so I start with simple questions like, what is radical and what is revolutionary? Because sometimes we hear the word radical and we may often think radical means extreme, from the outside, being disruptive. And I try to say, well, the root of the word radical is root. So what does it mean to be rooted in the work, to be rooted here and grounded in the core of it, not from outside in, but from inside out? How can we be radical in that way and take those bold, ambitious steps that the first radical of the seed comes out, that it starts somewhere, and it can be in the kind of dark, dirty, messy space, but you're guided towards something. And similar for revolutionary, the root of the word there is revolutions, which is cycles. So how can I be revolutionary? By being complicit in regenerative cycles, which are abound in nature. And it is when we break these cycles, it's when we mess them up, that we get into trouble, and there are environmental challenges. Climate change, for example, as a disruption of the carbon cycle being one of the biggest ones. And so that allows me to take a lot of this work that can seem big and, like I said, heavy, discomforting for a range of people. And you might hear the word colonization and say, whoa, what is that about? Or that I struggle with that because I thought my work was just to connect more people to the parks, or I thought my work was just this ecological restoration of this landscape. And I say it's all of that, because in the practice of this, as different members of the community are engaged in different aspects of addressing what I call the system of harms, I say, well, let's look at what is the logic that drives some of these conditions, and then how could we begin to do different? And I don't mean just complete running away from it, but rather let me look at what we can embrace of what we're fighting for as much as we're fighting against. And so when I look at things like elements of colonization, or where people use terms like white supremacy or patriarchy and so forth, I know that for some people they say, like, I don't know how that's part of my work, when all I cared about is connecting more people, more communities to the outdoors. And so it's an invitation that I tell people how we can all still play a role in engaging in this work. I say, well, what happens if we go from a reductive mechanistic worldview that has created and guided a lot of our systems in place, for example, how we relate with nature and the outdoors and with each other, and we flip that to a worldview, to a life-honoring worldview? We find that a lot of the language, a lot of the invitations there are grounded in so much of the work we already do, like thrivability, like nature's abundance, like stewardship, like regeneration, regenerative development, and so forth. So by which I mean is, it also provides an opportunity to engage with a lot of the other worldviews that different communities have about our relationship with each other and the natural world. And that we can go from not just seeing a tree as a natural resource that is categorized, in which we have this human object relationship. I am the human, there is the thing, we measure it, we classify it, we get data from it. How do we move from it just treating it as a natural resource to a natural relative? And what does it mean then to have non-human kin? How does that open you to be receptive and be aware of the other ways of knowing and the additional worldviews that Native Indigenous communities have? How does that open you to really think about how some communities value being in community with each other in the landscape different than how some of us may have experienced it? So it's a lot. But this is important to me because I say it's inclusive of, but not limited to. I'm not asking people to throw everything away of how they think about the world. I'm asking for us to think about how we can be expansive and right down to, for example, in your workplace and how you might hear an expression like your team is functioning like a well-oiled machine. And you hear that and it's like, oh, it means we're doing a great job. How is that bad? It means we're being efficient. And I say it's not about seeing like how it's bad. It's me saying, I don't want to be limited to that being the only way. So what would happen if we were to say or hear your team is functioning like a well-nurtured meadow or like a thriving meadow? And if they said, well, that sounds ridiculous. And I'm like, well, why does a well-oiled machine sound better? Those are part of the questions I can begin to ask myself, because I'd like to think few of us that love nature and have the stoke of the outdoors are in conservation work. How many of us are going to go to a meadow and say, hey, meadow, you're not meadowing enough today. I can't believe you're not meadowing up to meadow standards. It is ridiculous. We know that we might not have all of the answers yet, but the questions can still make us think about what we're valuing in terms of leadership, in terms of relationships, in terms of efficiency, outputs, and so forth. And so with that, I'll close with another example of when I don't just talk about the logic, but about the role of culture to be inclusive of communities that maybe have been seen as not part of the work. Maybe they haven't seen themselves as part of the work. And what does it mean to, again, be expansive? It's not an either or, it's a both and. So here's a picture of April 22nd, 1970, first Earth Day. And so when you look at that picture of the planet, there it is, Earth Day. And then we look at a picture of the kids planting trees. You could look at that and probably easily say, yeah, that makes sense for the first Earth Day. But that was actually the founding of Chicano Park in San Diego, California. So on the same day, you had this community that rose up in protest because they heard that this lot that they've always wanted it to be a park was going to be developed as the California Highway Patrol substation. And they basically said no more. They wanted a park. And so they protested and kind of took over the plot of land and really wanted a park, not just from the green space, but for the cultural space, for the community space. And so some of those are those early kind of indicators in terms of what it's helpful for us to think of what we shape as the constructs of things like parks, of the outdoors, of recreation, of open space, and so forth. And another story that I often share is as ways to interrogate, right? And not just interrogate the logic, but interrogate the narratives. Many of us maybe have been involved in the American environmental movement can hear the words Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, and we begin to have a story in our minds about what that was. And it's a great story. It's a necessary story because Rachel Carson, as a woman, for her gender, faced a lot of straight up resistance and really a lot of kind of demeaning experiences when she was trying to get an important message out. And the importance of that message was and is still necessary in terms of how are we negatively impacting the environment, for example, through the use of DDT that can affect something as iconic as these birds of prey. And so that story is there, that, hey, this is bad. How do we go ahead and challenge this? And that's the story that came out. For example, that even for me growing up, this is a story that I heard. The founders of Environmental Defense Fund brought the original DDT lawsuit in Suffolk County, New York, where they showed that ospreys were having poor reproductive success in eggs that had not hatched because of DDT. The lawsuit eventually led to a ban of DDT. It's considered a great conservation success. But then part of what's missing is that at the same time, you actually had another lawsuit in California on behalf of migrant farm workers. This was both through California Rural Legal Assistance and the United Farm Worker Movements. in that they ended up combining their lawsuits, and that this marriage of convenience worked out really well for conservation organizations like EDF. It, of course, worked out really well in terms of an environmental success, but it did not work well in terms of a human labor or an immigrant rights success, even though it was the fact that it was helpful to have in court have standing in terms of the human impact. Because even now, but especially back then, right, nature doesn't have standing in court. The birds don't have standing in court. You have to be able to say, well, where's the harm? And here you could show the people are a part of it. And yet that story was just left out. And so those are questions where we look at, say, well, what's the role of power in terms of how does that come into play? But also when I tell people in farm working immigrant communities, you've been a part of this work from the beginning. You may not be aware of it. You may not have known the history. We might still be struggling with it up to this day. I said, but the work that we do is outdoors work, is nature work, is conservation work, is environmental work. It may look different and we can add to it, but it should not feel like you're fitting that narrative of still new to this. So here's some of the sources of that. And so that's one of those narratives, for example, of saying, not treat you like you're always new here. Here's an example from California where we were back in 2013, we're saying, oh, Hispanics are going to become the biggest ethnic group in California, surpassing whites for the first time. That's incomplete and false, because when California was founded as a state, Hispanics in the former Californians were the majority group. But what that misses is, of course, the impacts of things like the gold rush and other elements of exclusion that led to the reduction of not just the indigenous native communities, but of course the Hispano community that came after. And so I share all of that because that's what I mean when I talk about some of the historic realities. And so I have to be able to have that in consideration when we do outdoor nature conservation work, so that I know that it's not a no, I'm not interested, or I don't see myself part of that, doesn't automatically have to mean that it's individual lack of interest. That there could be reasons why a community or individuals say, no, I'm good. And so a lot of us may look for the easy work on intentional users, kind of people that already have a foot in the work, because, oh, you already like to hike, great, come join us. Ooh, you're already out on the trails, yeah, sweet, come on over. And what happens to intentional non-users that you don't see, that don't show up, that you invited them once and they didn't take you up on the offer, and then you just say, I guess they're just not interested. Again, it's kind of like going to that question, well, what's the difference between hiking and walking outdoors? But it's necessary. And that's where a lot of the work with Latino Outdoors and other affinity-based groups, a lot of even the work that we do with the Outdoorist Oath is about expanding that sense of identity, of belonging, but also connecting a lot of leadership already present in the space to be part of the invitation for more, to invite community members that maybe if they see someone very different than them, they're like, it's just easier for me to say no, because I already know it's not going to work out for me. But then if they see someone like Miguel here, they're like, oh, wait, he's like me. And he's doing these things that I didn't consider, didn't see myself thinking that I could do. That becomes a connection. And so I'll close by saying, for me, I've also approached this as the work of a conservation cultura. What does it mean to take some of these cultural elements and practices that have become affirming for me, that have become more of a source of pride rather than a source of shame growing up, and using those to leverage some of these connections through my art, through expressions, to cultural statements and norms, right back down to here we go with the DET and farm workers. And it's a way that I continue to invite the work across the board. And Latino Outdoors, this is the 10th year anniversary. So what started out with a question of where are there others like me, grew into a community and organization that now is present throughout the United States. with just an amazing, talented community of leaders that put together all kinds of outdoor experiences, including right here in Colorado. And it's led me to be able to support and advance this work at all levels in the community. And when we talk about both not just supporting policy changes, changing the narratives, being able to influence the field, the curriculum, in the way that we not just say we are here, estamos aquí, but at the same time be able to say that there is a role for all of us in doing this work. So I will stop here by saying, in the words of Dolores Huerta, si se puede, yes, we can. It's a way to say that it is possible, pero hazlo, but you got to do it. So I'm excited both by the work that allies undertake to support more community connection, as well as to anybody who ever thought, hey, I'm interested in that, but I didn't think it was for me. To think about what providing that support looks like, and not just about what is possible, but what we can accomplish. And that's part of the work that I'm excited to continue to do. So, gracias. Aquí paro. Si hay preguntas, well, if there's questions, we'll take them, but it's been a pleasure to share this time with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jose. Perfect. Yeah. So if you all have questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A. We'll give people a bit. That was wonderful presentation, extremely comprehensive. Really appreciate, the background history as well as how that's been integrated into your own work. That was really fascinating.
Thank you. I know it can be a lot. And I tell people that the idea is to, provide the full scope of how I approach this work so that I know, I often say it's inclusive of, but not limited to, so that people know that I want to connect the stoke that someone could have the outdoors with the necessary work based about the realities of lived experiences for someone that has had a very different lived experience, so that it acknowledges the hardness of it that can be there with the joyful elements of it. So,
Lexi, I'd like to ask a question. It's
Absolutely.
Kristen here. I'll turn on my video here just a second. Thank you again, Jose. I loved that one slide where you had the well-oiled machine and then the expansive, thriving meadow. Yes. That's just so graphically captures, I think, a lot of what you were saying. And I was just wondering, from your work with different members of Latino Outdoors, can you describe some projects that you would say were thriving meadows for you, that just felt like thriving meadows? They were really, just really were on. I'm just curious what some of those experiences have been.
Yeah. I would say Latino Outdoors as a community is a thriving meadow. And part of why that, and then I'll give like a programmatic, a smaller, more focused programmatic example. But part of what initially we really wanted to see with Latino Outdoors, in which our current executive director, Luis Villa, has been really, I think, has continued to nurture and flourish. For me, it's what I've often called as network leadership principles. They're kind of these research-based principles about what supports network impact, network change, and not just like individual or organizational growth, which is still necessary. Because, for example, if we have an organization and we want to see that thrive, but it's different when we say, what does it mean to really do the meadow work? So 4 principles. The first one is mission over organization. So really be able to look at, when I make these resource decisions, when we look at these opportunities for coordination and collaboration or coalition work, are there times where a focus on the organization gets in the way of necessary mission and vision work? And it's easy to say but hard to do. I'll get to that in a minute. Second principle is trust over control, and be able to ask, how often do we lead with trust compared to control, and why? What's in place that impedes or facilitates that? Third one is humility over brand. And then the fourth one is build constellation, not stars. And one of the primary researchers behind this, Dr. Jane Wynne-Skillern, likes to say they're common sense, but not commonplace. So even as I say them, you're like, yeah, of course, make sure you got to nurture, trust and relationship building. We want to do trust-based philanthropy instead of transactional. Humility, not brand. Of course, yeah, we want to be able to not just brandish our own brand. All of these things, like, yes, got it, makes sense. But they're not commonplace, because often what gets rewarded is the opposite. What gets rewarded is control. What gets rewarded is star building. What gets rewarded is organization over mission. And so those are the ways in which we say the meta work for me is to provide that work. So I tell people, even a relational example can be if we are two peers and colleagues both doing this work, and there's value in looking good, looking competent. Look, I can lead a program, and I'm a leader. But if I am only focusing on making myself look good, and you're focusing on making yourself look good, understandable. Mm-hmm. But now what if I also work on making you look good, and then you now work on making me look good? We're still both looking good, but the nature of the relationship support is different. And it's a way that we elevate that. So that's kind of the big one. And then smaller is, of course, do the necessary. I often think with one of the first outings that we led, in that we invited a group of families to a Sunday outing at a state park. And so when the family showed up, they saw and heard Sunday, outing, and park. So that means they showed up in their Sunday best right after church. They came with the whole family, and they thought, park, all right, I guess we're going to do some fun recreational activities. They weren't wrong, but this was a riparian park where it was more about the restoration of the landscape. There wasn't a soccer field, there wasn't a playground, all of those things. And we were going to go on a trail. So rather than me thinking, and in fact, for that day, I was the only one in quote unquote outdoorsy clothing and gear. But rather than saying, oh no, you are not dressed for, the thing, you are not this, you are not that. I was like, actually, they are. Is what they're wearing safe and comfortable for what we're going to take? Yes. Am I supporting the intergenerational connections that are values to them? Yes. Do all I need to do is provide a little bit more information about how this is also a park? Yes. And we had a great time, because then I had a dad point out a bunch of different plants throughout the trail. I'm like, wow, it's amazing. How do you know all of this? You're basically a naturalist. And he said, I'm a landscaper, so I'm familiar with a lot of these. I'm like, that's the way that you're inclusive of, and not lead with assumptions and presumptions about what the community adds to the experience.
Boy, there were a lot of kernels of knowledge there.
Yeah.
Oh, we have a question and answer in the chat there.
We do. See Karen.
Yeah, so
yeah,
when it says, when you were growing up, what influenced you to pursue this work? So yeah, you mentioned, I think you grew up in California, and then if you can talk about that a bit.
I can say a couple of things, and I know there's another question in the Q&A. So one is, as an immigrant kid from Mexico, my first 9 years in Mexico, the outdoors was just outside. In the same way that often kids maybe that here in the US grow up in rural areas or grow up in a farm, and you're like, yeah, the outdoors is just outside. And it wasn't hiking, it was just walking to school, right? It wasn't camping, it was spending a night at the rancho, all of these different elements. But coming to the US, I say it added to that, in the sense that now the outdoors was a place we traveled to, and there were different recreational elements. And as a sixth grader, I went to Calaveras Big Tree State Park in California, which had giant sequoias. I've never seen anything like that. Blew my mind. And so those were some of those positive, transformative experiences as youth that the research says, hey, if we provide these, it helps. And so that was one of those seeds. The other seed was that as an undergraduate student, as part of my teaching preparation work, we got to do an outdoor education program for migrant students who were primarily English language speakers, Latino youth. And so that meant I worked with 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, being an outdoor ed instructor. And that really also influenced to pursue this work, because I was like, here are kids like me, and they get to see someone like themselves do this and bring joy to it. And, you know, the reality is that maybe we didn't grow up with the sleeping bag. And so our parents sent the cobijas for us to camp. And then we might have been a little embarrassed. But now I'm there telling them, like, don't worry about it. I did the exact same thing. And those little points of connection, affirmation, and really valuing. And again, for me, it's expansive of really matter, because it's kind of like coming to this country. And it wasn't about letting go and forgetting Spanish. It was about being additive with English. And so those are the ways in which I say, making those little switches, that it's not an either or zero-sum loss. There's many opportunities to be additive, and that has shaped and influenced my work a lot.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you. We have another question. Where is your favorite natural area to recreate and enjoy the land?
Yeah, that is a great question. I always struggle with anything that is kind of the best or favorite, because I have so many, and I don't mean that to sound like a quote unquote cop-out answer, but I'll give you some examples. So I love places that give me a sense of perspective, either kind of from the very small to the very big. And so that means places like Redwood Forest, I just adore, because they make me feel small, but in a way that comes with awe and appreciation. I was like, wow, look at these majestic giants, like these elders of the land. What does it mean to be in that perspective? And then also I love ridge trails, for example, because they give me that vista, that sense of view and awe and majesty. And so I might, hit up some of the range county parks right there in Colorado. I might go, and I love in Northern California, the state and coastal redwood parks. I have appreciation for landscapes like deserts that, for me, challenge the narrative of deserts as being these lifeless places. And so even now when people say, oh, this is as dead as a desert, I'm like, I get there might be some deserts like that, but more often than not, deserts have their own abundance. And so it makes me really kind of appreciate that. I've had the opportunity to visit the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and often say kind of like that landscape is oceanic. And so there's many landscapes that protected spaces that I really adore, both throughout Colorado and through the US. And so, but I like the ones that get me to be connected and grounded with the land, and really make me not be, not be complacent in my perspective.
Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah, I think a lot of the Coloradans here will completely agree with you that, yeah, the mountains are very humbling in the most beautiful, majestic way. So we share the love of the vista with you too. So that's great. I do have a kind of a bigger question that I don't have completely well thought out, but I would love just, from the Broomfield Open Space and Trails perspective, we are updating our comprehensive plan for open spaces and trails. So we did a big public outreach, with that, just trying to get people to ask them what they want to see out of the spaces. And a lot of people just said more, that we love the open space, we love the trails, we would love to have more of them. We don't have very, in terms of measuring use, we have trail counters that we use in order to figure out, popular trails that are really great. But of course, that just gives you counts. So in terms of measuring the people that are using them, we would love, of course, to be as equitable as possible. So what are sort of your best practices for creating outdoor equitable spaces? Anything that you can pass along to us? And I know that's a huge question, but
it is, but I'll share a couple of examples that often provide for me. Like I said, it may not be like the answer, but often it leads me it provides an orientation that then maybe I can ask more and find out what's unique and different in terms of the community. So one of them is there's a case study in which the idea is that you designed a park and maybe you provided picnic tables. And if, again, as I said, demographics of 2050 compared to 1950, if you might have designed it in a way that has, again, the construct of a family to mean this, right? 2.4 kids or whatever, 2 parents, and therefore it's like, here's the table, and not consider what family means for different communities, that it means also the uncles, the grandparents, cousins, like you name it. The idea here was that they designed the space with picnic tables, and then staff would come the following day and find that a bunch of the tables have been moved together. And if you saw that and say, oh no, like this is disruptive, let's put the tables back and chain them down, then you're communicating the opposite of, you're missing what's the story that is being told right there, which is like, guess what? This is actually great. You have families coming and they want to be here, but the space maybe wasn't designed with them in mind. So then that's an opportunity to ask, how would this be different if we designed this with them in mind? That's one piece. The other one is to also not then get caught up in taking that as a stereotype and misunderstanding that for a cultural norm, or that the interest that a community might still have in what you have. So what I mean is, some spaces may be preserves in the sense of like the higher valuation here is the protection of this ecological landscape compared to an abundance of impactful recreational activities, right? And so people might say, well, maybe Latino families won't care as much because there isn't a soccer field. And I was like, well, you can't. It's not on you to decide. Do you know that is the question? Yes, there might be elements where they say we actually want the soccer field because there aren't any recreational opportunities. So if you're offering that, of course, we'd love to see it. But other times is, I say stereotype instead of cultural norm. We did an outing with regional open space district, and they were concerned that maybe the families wouldn't be interested because it's exactly that. They're like, it's a preserve. There's minimal infrastructure. And we're just not sure if that's going to be interesting to the families. And it was quite the opposite. The families, the dads were like, we love these rock formations. You have mothers that say this feels so peaceful and like really calm and nice compared to some of the realities that we have to deal at home. And so sometimes it's being able to look at that. And then lastly, that kind of that difference between stereotype and cultural norm is to ask yourself, right? Like, do I know? How do I know? And how am I supportive of some of this experiences while being informative and corrective as needed and helpful? What I'm getting at is we also would get some dads that saying, I stopped going to that park, not because I just wanted to, I love going there, but all of my initial interactions used to be the ranger asking me I had a permit for that. And I said, well, I didn't know I needed a permit. Or, well, then how do I get a permit? But the conversation had already been framed as one of correction first, welcome later, rather than welcome first and then support for any correction that was needed. And that makes a difference, because it is it connects and impacts to that sense of welcome and belonging. And so that meant we for our next outing, let's invite all the rangers and let's start with that conversation so that you can hear from the community how they understand what they do, but they also may not understand some of the things that you do. So then you can start from a place of supporting each other rather than seeing each other as, as the ones to avoid. And so that made a difference. And then at the end of the day, to try, to try, and stumbling is part of the work, but embed some of those reparative actions. I would say what heals the harm, because then I often think that you can't be surprised by the willingness for some communities to hold grace for you and patience for you. But what's hard for them is when they see a lack of action or indifference. As we joke, when they know they care, you're gonna get invited to invited to the carne asada, because they're like, all right, you know what, come on through.
Yeah, we have to do it, as your last slide said. Yeah, that's great. The importance is to try. Love that.
You want me to come on now, Lexi?
Sure. Yeah. Karen, thank you so much. I think we've reached the end of our time. Quick hour filled with, lots of nuggets of wisdom. So again, we're so grateful, Jose, for sharing your vast amount of experience and knowledge with us to a topic that, very near and dear to our hearts. So we really appreciate the time. With that, I'll turn it over to our president of the Broomfield Open Space Foundation, Karen Steele.
Thank you, Jose, for being with us. What a great role model you are to Latinos and all cultures. And I really appreciate your words tonight. And the meadow really hit me, as I know it hit Kristen too, but that meadow, the open meadow, is a beautiful picture to paint instead of the well-oiled machines. So thank you so much for that. And I feel like I've learned so much about how we can make our open spaces friendly to different cultures, different family units. And I know that's something that Kristen's team and our Broomfield Open Space Foundation, we have had deep conversations about this. So, and we'll continue those. And you've just added another knowledge base to that. So thank you, Jose. And the Broomfield Community Foundation, we're a nonprofit, and we would like to give you a virtual check for $200 to use for your foundation. I know you're involved in a lot of organizations, and so we know that you put this to good use. Last year, we were giving our speakers $100, and you are the first recipient of we felt like this was so valuable and important that we upped our game to $200. So thank you, and just know how much we appreciate you.
It's received with gratitude. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And then I'm just going to plug, Lexi, a couple of other things along the same cultural lines. We, with the Broomfield Open Space Foundation, along with Broomfield Open Space and Trails, we are having a soil exchange with the Arapaho and Cheyenne Nations. I'm really excited about that. It's like October 11th, and it will be at the Bruner House. And it's at noon. And I think it will be a very moving experience for everyone. We also have upcoming on October 13th at Metzger Farm, we have Migratory Bird and a Night Skies program. So that will be really fun. And I like to say we're getting two birds with one stone. We've got the stars and the birds, and I don't know, but so please join us for that. We also have some seed harvesting and seed planting events coming up in October. And I just encourage you to look at Broomfield Foundation Open Space Facebook page, or you can go to the Kristen and Lexi's website, with the open space and trails. You can, Lexi, can you explain how to access that?
Yes. Yeah, it is broomfield.org/open space. And then there is a section that has events on there. So you can see all of the upcoming events.
Yeah, and you'll see them all on the Foundation's open space page, Facebook page, and then as well as Broomfield Open Space and Trails. And we are, the last piece is we are hosting a fishing derby, and it's just for kids, Lexi. You can't participate in this, it's just for kids. And that's going to be coming up really soon on September 30th. And today we spent building fishing poles for that, but it's going to be a fun event, but you have to register your children at thebeatrex.com. So be sure to take a look at all those. I mean, there's more information out there, and that will really guide you to what your interests are. So I am going to say thank you. Thank you, Jose, again, so much. Pleasure to virtually meet you. Lexi, I'm kicking it back your way.
Perfect. Yes. Thank you so much, Jose. And thank you so much for everyone for joining us. This is recorded. It will be on our website at broomfield.org/open space. So you can continue to share to everyone as well. But with that, I will bid you good night and thank you so much for joining us. Have
Good
a great
night.
night.
Thank you,
Night,
Jose.
everyone.
Thank you, Lexi.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.